Hello there, and welcome back to a narrated reading of Wearing Power Armor to a Magic School by JCB112. You can find their work on Royal Road and on Reddit, link in the description below. Part 2. 10 months prior to arrival. There was once a time when I liked fantasy. A time when things were simpler and the world just seemed like one big adventure waiting to be undertaken. I'd grown up on newsreels of the first interstellar drives to break the Warp 5 limit, and films that documented the first landings on habitable worlds not of our own design. I'd spent hours upon hours on the soft, carpeted floors of my living room, reading and fantasizing about hidden worlds just beyond the snowy forests that flanked our small 2-story home. Not a weekend was spent without me and my parents regaling each other with tales of heroes and kingdoms in the far-off lands. Not a season was spent without a new hyperfixation on a new campaign to be played between schoolwork and chores. I was living in a fantasy until one chilly autumn morning when it all came crashing down. One phone call was all it took. A single conversation ripped a line between what I'd call my idyllic youth and the wake-up call that was my teens. In the weeks that followed, I watched as the world around me was torn apart. Relatives and adults I barely knew began barging in and picking apart the warmth and comfort that had been my home. Family photos stored in boxes, shelves emptied and dismantled, the attic where my mom and I would go on adventures to kingdoms and faraway lands, cleaned out without hesitation. The spaces and places that I had once known slowly transformed into a hollow shell of themselves as the days and weeks went by, until they finally took me as well, away from the only place I knew, and the only life I had known. I never saw my home again. I never even set foot in my hometown after I was relocated to my distant aunt's apartment in the city. Sometimes I even wondered if my memories of that small town life were all part of the fantastical stories that I'd grown up with, because imagining a world so perfect, so untouched by everything, was almost too fantastical in and of itself. Plaster and wallpapered walls replaced the warm oaks and pines I once took for granted. A skyline soaring hundreds upon hundreds of stories overhead likewise became the norm, as was the finely manicured park that was a 20-minute subway ride away from the apartment I now called home. No longer could I just exit the kitchen and find an expansive open yard surrounded by a dense patch of conifers, and no longer could I spend hours upon hours staring out at the little nook in the front porch's windowsill, gazing as the seasons shifted from one to the other. The city was a whole different beast, and it was one that I'd grown to love in a strange sort of way. People here wouldn't bother you, even if you were in the middle of a crowd of thousands or an apartment complex filled with thousands more. The faces all blended together. Everyone was too busy forging their own paths in life, so much so that I found it difficult to form any attachments. It's been an entire decade since I left my childhood behind, and I can proudly say that I've come to call this concrete jungle my new home. My caseworkers told me that many people in my situation would prefer to retreat further into fantasy and fiction, but I did the exact opposite. The illusion of fiction was just too much to bear after having the rug torn from under me. So I focused on what mattered instead, real life. I was running on autopilot, as some of my friends would say. I got good enough grades at school, volunteered in extracurricular activities as decorative pieces for my college application, and did what was expected of me. I needed to move on from what I had lost. I wanted to leave that past behind in any way I could. I found structure and direction in the JROTC, and from what few conversations my aunt and I had, it was clear that she agreed with me. Not surprising, given how she was a veteran of the Jovian uprisings. Yet I wouldn't have expected that my journey into military would lead me to a fate that further entangled me with the past I so desperately wished to move beyond. Indeed, I wasn't expecting what was supposed to be the start of my college life to be a backtrack into fantasy. The Institute for Anomalous Studies, Earth, 10 months prior to arrival. Director Laura Weir. Emma was the perfect candidate, a 19-year-old college freshman with an impeccable academic record, alongside commendations on her JROTC reports. This alone wouldn't have made her stand out if it wasn't for the fact that she had little in the way of familial or social attachments. This latter factor was especially vital, given the sensitive nature of this operation. An operation that would see the greatest risk ever undertaken by a single human being, second only to the perilous flights of humanity's first FTL-capable vessels, an operation that would indeed see her flung into a great, perilous unknown, disconnected and completely cut off from the rest of civilization, just like those brave pioneers centuries ago. Whilst the first human flights into the great unknown were preceded and accompanied by much fanfare, this great leap, however, would not. For it presents a risk far greater than any FTL experiment ever would, carrying with it the weight of an existential threat we've been tasked with studying and neutralizing. For centuries now, we've been observing, tracking, analyzing, and studying what is an undeniable evidence of a world parallel to our own. A world that lurks just beneath the surface, that served as a source of myths and legends for our ancestors, and that continues to serve as a limitless pool of inspiration to those gifted enough to peer across the veil, inadvertently acting as a source of inspiration for countless works of fantasy and fiction. Indeed, this world would have been left at that, fiction, if it wasn't for us. Shunned and practically excommunicated by the scientific community, our outlandish claims were pushed aside as the march of progress continued ever onwards. Even so, as evidence began to stack and as proof continued to mount, we eventually garnered the attention of the United Nations Science Advisory, who eventually saw fit to incorporate us into what is now the IAS. What we discovered was irrefutable evidence of what could only be described as a world of magic and sorcery, a fantasy world by every metric, and one that had the potential to upend our own. It was because of this existential threat that every resource was eventually poured into peering deeper into this world and its non-analogous scientific principles. Yet, the more we tried peering in, the less information we got back. It was a battle of diminishing returns that lasted for centuries before we finally made a breakthrough, our equivalent of discovering the Rosetta Stone. We discovered a means of communicating with the powers on the other side of the fence, and indeed, we later discovered this was intentional. The journey we'd been on for the past few centuries, the discovery of this puzzle, as they called it was all a test. It was a test to determine the magical potential for those gifted from the other worlds. Indeed, it was a test that was considered commonplace, and had been in place for what was described to us as eons now. We were just late to the party. Mumbles were heard on the other side discussing how we technically weren't ever expected to pass the test, given how magically deficient our species naturally were. It was later revealed to us that every other civilization in our own galaxy had long since passed, and that we were effectively the last to follow suit. As a result, we would be the last to enter this realm of magic and sorcery. This perhaps explained why it was that we had detected no other technologically advanced civilizations, even as we developed FTL and roamed the galaxy for intelligent life. Theories abound on how this divergent pathway could have stagnated technological development, but that was a story for another day. Our correspondence led us to the understanding that upon completion of this test, that a single candidate be sent through the threshold for further evaluation before their host civilization was allowed to fully peer into this great unknown. It called for a candidate of 19 years of age, of any rank and station, with what they described to us as a heart of gold and a willingness to accept what is beyond the known, and willing to sacrifice everything should it come to it. Yet, as we sent our first candidate through the threshold, it was clear that not only were we magically deficient, but that magic was actively rejecting us. Despite being in full PPE that should have protected against every hazard known to science, our first candidate was returned to us in a near unrecognizable state. An autopsy revealed the signs of a breakdown of cellular matrices at a microscopic level, and what would only be described as near liquefaction of our first human candidate. But after some time was allowed for grieving, alongside whatever cover stories were needed to keep this under wraps, we knew we had to try again. It was decided then that we would spend however much more time was necessary in order to study, probe, and poke at the dangers that lie beyond this threshold in order to best counter it and use every tool at our disposal. Decades, and after what we hoped weren't lethal doses of mana radiation later, we finally pulled it off. The ultimate expression of human defiance against an environment that would see us dead without an iota of empathy or compassion. The culmination of centuries of work, of sacrifice, and hardship. The Mark I exoreality and atypical radiation-resistant suit, or what most in the team now colloquially referred to as the Enchanted Power Armor. Based on the framework of modern power armor expressly designed for combat in the vacuum of space, the suit was nothing short of a technological marvel. Layers upon layers of exotic materials protected the wearer from a total of 29 distinct types of magical radiation. A hermetically sealed oversuit and helmet prevented any exposure to the air and kept any foreign contaminants, be it biological or chemical, from coming into contact with the wearer. Pieces of composite armor were attached almost identically to the original design, with all of this weight carefully distributed and compensated by an exoskeleton sandwiched between the undersuit and oversuit, hence the term power armor. Gauntlet-mounted laser and kinetic personal defense weapons were attached to both arms, despite the other side calling for the candidate to be sent unarmed. Despite all this effort, a candidate was still needed to cross the threshold, and that's where Emma comes in. The Institute for Anomalous Studies, Earth, 10 minutes prior to arrival. Emma Brooker. To say that the situation presented to me all those months ago was nothing short of unreal would be an understatement. Indeed, for a while I had assumed me being taken here was part of some elaborate PsyOps recruitment drive targeting new, unsuspecting members of the ROTC. It took hours before I was finally convinced that this entire situation was what the director claimed it to be. I should have guessed as much, though, because I doubt grabbing college freshmen straight out of the parking lot and into the back seat of a blacked-out SUV was anything but standard protocol. The offer presented before me was something that no other human in history had ever been given. The opportunity to travel not just beyond the speed of light or beyond the galactic quadrant, but to a whole other dimension. It was a world of, as the director had put it herself, swords and sorcery, of indescribable history and culture, a world I fundamentally had no interest in, and yet still somehow drew me in despite my desire to escape its allure. Perhaps this was the real reason why they chose me. Perhaps this was why, out of all the countless more candidates they probably had, that I would be the one to don the encounter suit. Perhaps they knew that I just couldn't help but to accept such an offer. Indeed, even I didn't know why I signed up without hesitation. Perhaps it was because I craved to follow the motions of what was expected of me. Perhaps it was a latent drive to tap into that childhood fantasy. Perhaps it was just that innate human spirit of adventure, of breaking yet another barrier that stood in the way of human progress. Whatever it was, I knew that by signing, I was more than likely never going to see home, family, or friends again for at least a whole year while attending this academy on the other side of the portal. So much for my plans for college. Who knows, maybe they'll accept transfer credits. The loss of contact with my friends and family didn't bother me that much. It wasn't as if I had any tangible attachments anywhere anyways. The military was what gave me purpose in recent years, and it would be the military that would be backing me up in this adventure going forward. If anything, I would have all to gain and nothing to lose from this venture. So with the single stroke of a pen, the grueling training began in earnest. It was months of specialized training, focusing on theory, protocol, but most important of all, the practical instructions necessary for a life of prolonged suiting. The power armor was described to me as being more akin to a spacesuit, and it was promptly drilled into me that it would be the only barrier between myself and the other dimension's unrepentantly volatile environment. How any native civilization, let alone species, had managed to evolve and survive there, I did not know. What I did know, however, was that an entire year of being cooped up in PPE would be challenging to say the very least. Which was also why I was given a sort of inflatable tent. One that had the same mana-resistant properties as the suits, but with the downsides of being unbelievably fragile, so fragile that even an off-the-counter kitchen knife could pose a real threat to it. Yet it would be my only respite in between prolonged periods of suiting, and would be required for routine maintenance when the time did call for it. Weapons, survival, and tactical exercises were all part of the training regimen, all with a heavy emphasis on the suit's various subsystems. A fine piece of technology that I was beginning to grow fond of, given the lengths that the UN's best and brightest have gone to transform an EVA workhorse into a platoon's worth of force projection. Yet training and briefing on the other dimension was worryingly lacking. The director herself admitted that we were going in half-blind, with far less than they would have liked to work off of. It was admittedly up to me to make up for the lack of intel in situational adaptability and personal initiative. I wanted to tell her that the latter would be easier said than done, but given the circumstance, I held back on it. Eventually, however, the time did come for my training, my skills, and my resolve to be put to the ultimate test. As I stood there in the middle of a lab straight out of the science fiction movie, with administrative staff, military attaches, and leading scientific minds all hiding behind a veritable bunker that overlooked a room filled to the brim with monitoring equipment and strange runic markings on the floor. Whatever happens, cadet, know that you're making history, and that you're making your country, your people, and the entirety of the human race proud. Out of the 252 billion humans in this galaxy, you will be one of the only two to have stepped through this threshold. The director spoke in a rousing speech which elicited a few claps from behind her, as I responded with a single thumbs up and a nod.
Neil Armstrong, Peter Lee, Jean Rousseau, and Eleanor Sobek all had something to say before they made their big leaps forward, didn't they?
I asked as the portal before me started to grow in increasing size and intensity.
If I can even be compared to any of them, that is, I'd like to say something as well.
Whatever it is, you better make it a quick one, cadet. The portal's about to reach criticality.
Humanity has always reached for the stars, reaching ever outwards toward the heavens. Today, humanity reaches beyond the stars, beyond the heavens, into the pages of fiction itself.
The Transgration Academy for the Magical Arts, Nexus, Emma Brooker. It happened almost instantly. In fact, it felt as if nothing had happened at all, as all I saw was the drab concrete and composite walls suddenly disappearing for a split second, only to be replaced with a room that looked like it was pulled straight from a recreation of Versailles. It was the same feeling you'd get when leaving one room and entering another, except without ever actually physically moving at all. My eyes had barely adjusted to that sudden shift in my surrounding before I was met face to face with what could only be described as three humanoid figures pulled straight from a fantasy novel. They all stared at me with the same shocked expression I probably had underneath the opaque lenses of my helmet. Yet, as I noticed their robed figures and, most importantly, the distinct coloration between each of them, it became clear to me that these three most likely belonged to whatever staff, faculty, or hierarchy that existed here. Different colored robes denoting different ranks, departments maybe? Clearly some sort of hierarchy, which means officials, staff, faculty, teachers? I thought to myself as I held up a single suited hand and waved.
Hi, I'm Emma, the new student from Earth.
My whole body tensed as I spoke those words, realizing what I'd just done. I gave my speech before I arrived here, which means the first words ever spoken by a human in this new reality would be, "Oh God, what have I done?" It didn't take long, however, before the silence was promptly broken by the most striking figure in the group, a blue-robed elf, who immediately came to my side with an expression of growing concern.
I hear no breaths coming from through that suit of armor. Can you breathe? If someone has gone wrong with this contraption, please inform me immediately so that I can take you to the infirmary in order to remove— Whoa!
I raised up both my hands defensively. The mere mention of removing the suit sent my survival training into overdrive as I took a few steps back, taking a moment to gather myself.
I'm fine. I feel fine, at least, and the suit's fine as well. If I feel off or anything, I'll be sure to tell you. Sir?
I cocked my head, realizing that none of the three have yet to introduce themselves. Yes, the introductions. The black-robed one spoke next. This one was also elvish, except darker, almost purple. A purple with a hint of charcoal, like someone had poured activated charcoal into grape soda. His hair was black, slick, and was formed into two distinct locks. I am Council-appointed Professor Maltoy. I am in charge of administrative duties, relaying matters I deem of significance to the Privy Council and His Majesty the King himself. As a professor, I am in charge of the arts of perception and light. The man refused to acknowledge me in any other way than a piercing stare. I bowed my head all the same, though, not wanting to break any social faux pas on the first day.
And I am Professor Vanavan, assistant to the Dean and professor of Manifield Studies.
The blue-robed elf who had rushed up to me spoke, giving me half-nod before turning to this older, clearly winded red-robed professor.
This is Professor Belnor. She is in charge of the potions department and professor of potion crafting.
He spoke before raising both arms up in a welcoming gesture.
We are happy to have you here, Emma of Earthrealm.
Once introductions were firmly out of the way, I gave a firmer, deeper bow. The three responded with varying degrees of acknowledgement before Vanavan once more took charge of the group, gesturing for me to follow.
You will have to forgive me for the brashness of my outward concern. The fate of your predecessor still looms over this academy like a specter of great shame, a tragedy that none of us wishes to see repeated. I have personally taken it upon myself to ensure that you do not suffer this fate. So long as you remain within my purview, within the halls of this academy, I will see to it that your life is free from harm. Vanavan spoke with a certain severity that sent chills down my spine. The polite, caring expression contrasted heavily with the intensity of his speech, yet that intensity seemed to die down almost immediately as we left the foyer, now morphing into a more amicable, excitable expression. So it is clear that we will have much to discuss regarding your uniform and manner of dress, Emma of Earthrealm, though we should make haste to the orientation first and foremost. Everyone has been waiting with bated breath for your safe and timely arrival. As the grand double doors of the foyer closed behind us, I took note as the black-robed professor seemed to linger behind, his eyes fixated on a small slit nestled high up in the far-flung corner of the room. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode in this series. I'll see you guys later.